Alright, today my case study will be over the Hong Kong protests. This case study was kind of inspired by the Leaderless Movements project we did earlier on. I thought it was really interesting, so I chose it for my social movement case study. The agenda for today is going over what exactly are the Hong Kong protests, the social media they used, and how it's incorporated as a leaderless movement, and also the implications and conclusions we can draw from it. So, as far as what are the Hong Kong protests? So, until 1997, Hong Kong was ruled by Britain as a colony, but was then later returned to China. Under the one country, two systems arrangement, Hong Kong has some autonomy and people were given more rights. But starting in June 2019, surrounding plans to allow extradition to mainland China, people started protesting in the streets. Opponents of the bill said that this bill would risk exposing citizens of Hong Kong to unfair trials and violent treatment, and they argued that China would have too much influence over Hong Kong and could target activists. The extradition bill was first introduced in April of 2019. It would allow for criminal suspects to be extradited to mainland China under certain circumstances. So this kind of aroused a fear of undermining judicial independence from China. And people started with peaceful rallies initially, but it later devolved into chaos. Protesters started embracing violent behaviors in response to the brutal police tactics that they were facing. So hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. After weeks of protests later, Carrie Lam eventually said the bill would be suspended indefinitely. So protesters feared revival of the bill and continued protesting, calling for it to be withdrawn completely. Eventually, the bill was finally withdrawn in September, but protesters said that it was too little too late at that point. So on October 1st of 2019, China was celebrating 70 years of Communist Party rule, and Hong Kong experienced one of its most violent and chaotic days. An 18-year-old was shot in the chest with a live bullet as protesters fought officers with poles, gas bombs, and other projectiles. After that day, the government banned wearing face masks. In early November, a pro-Beijing lawmaker was stabbed in the street by a man pretending to be a supporter. 1 week later, a policeman shot at one protester at close range when activists were trying to set up a roadblock. Later that same day, another man was set on fire by anti-government protesters. In late November, a standoff between police and students barricaded on the campus of Hong Kong Polytechnic University went on for several days. So protesters in Hong Kong eventually started seeing some results. In November 2019, they held local council elections. This was kind of seen as a barometer of public opinion at the time. Protesters saw landslide results for their pro-democracy movements, where 17 of 18 councils were now controlled by pro-democracy councillors. So, although the protesters kind of got what they wanted with the withdrawal of the bill, they said it was too little too late, and they remained with their demands. Their 5 demands, not one not less, were that the protests not be characterized as riots. Secondly, for amnesty for arrested protesters. Third, an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality. Fourth, implementation of complete universal suffrage. And 5, the withdrawal of the bill, which obviously had already been met. So as far as when does it end, because this still is ongoing, nobody really knows exactly. China wants to avoid a military crackdown because they fear that the international business community would see a military intervention as the end of one country, two systems, and that could have a negative impact on the economy. However, China doesn't want to bend to the protesters' will because they see them as lawless. Hong Kong government and the police haven't done much to calm tensions, considering the police have pretty much backed up their violent tendencies so far, and protesters don't show any signs of stopping anytime soon, although there have been several arrests. So now we're going to be discussing how social media plays into the protests. Protesters use social media to avoid being identified and arrested by police. Using social media in protests in Hong Kong isn't anything new. Social media was used during the 2014 Yellow Umbrella pro-democracy movement, but what is new is that protesters are now using social media to demonstrate a heightened awareness of cybersecurity and an increased understanding of how to communicate across these media platforms. Also present is the battle for public opinion between the government and the police and the protesters. Both sides use images of police brutality and or the protester brutality to further their own agendas and try to win over public favor. For example, the Chinese government published videos of military vehicles on standby in Hong Kong to show that there is an active police presence. So, in terms of how this movement is a leaderless movement, one app called Telegram, which is a secure messaging app, was heavily utilized by protesters. Groups and channels on the app were created to share live newsfeed, action information, and intelligence about ongoing and upcoming activities. These were seen as coordination tools and mobilization channels. The Telegram app grew 323% year over year in July 2019 in Hong Kong, compared to an 82% worldwide. Smaller platforms like LAHKJ, which is kind of similar to Reddit, also grew in Hong Kong, starting with the protests. These platforms enabled smaller groups to initiate new agenda, campaign ideas, and strategies as well. Instagram was also heavily utilized. Protesters were able to share campaign posters, slogans, and images of police violence to further the campaign and raise awareness. The protests have remained leaderless because of the ability to coordinate group efforts and momentum on these different types of platforms. The utilization of the Reddit-like platforms and Telegram and Instagram. So this is different than before. Usually in the 2014 protests, they mostly used Facebook. So the introduction of these new type of platforms is kind of what has made this movement successful so far and has what's made it long-lasting. And the Hong Kong protests have also remained without a figurehead. Social media tools have given the pro-democracy movement characterization in a way. So the implications of the protests surrounding the Hong Kong movement have spread globally. There have been rallies of support in the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Canada, Australia as well. This movement is also different from previous protests in Hong Kong because of the focus on cybersecurity and heightened awareness of encryption. They also do not primarily use Facebook. They use a variety of social media platforms. Another implication is that this has shown the success that leaderless movements can have. We're entering a new age of social movements where there's not really a certain figurehead. However, this does raise problems of lack of sustainability. Because the movement started out peacefully, it's interesting that it's kind of progressed into this violent sort of thing, and that's not really going to be sustainable. The tension's going to continue to arise, and it's going to come to a head at some point, but it's just kind of a matter of when at this point. So the protests also sent the Hong Kong economy into a recession for the first time in a decade, so it showed that they have had a significant impact on the economy, and so the Chinese government is going to have to respond at some point as well. And here are the works cited.